Okay.
Welcome everybody to Matan's webinar, Mental Health as a Jewish Accessibility Issue with Ruti Regan. My name is Meredith Polsky. I'm the National Director of Institutes and Training at Matan, and we're so happy that you can be with us. Ruti is our Rabbinic Disability Scholar in Residence at Matan. She's a fifth-year rabbinical student at the Jewish Theological Seminary, and she brings extensive background in the field of disability and Jewish education. And without further ado, I'm happy to introduce Ruti.
Hi, everybody. So today we're going to talk about mental health as a Jewish accessibility issue. And the reason we're going to talk about that is because sometimes mental health is described solely in terms of a medical model sort of treatment, access to treatment issue, but it's also an accessibility issue like any other disability issue. And if we talk about it in those terms, we open up a lot of opportunities for inclusive community. So, one note about language is that people have a lot of different preferences about language for referring to these issues. People tend to be very emphatic in their preferences and are not necessarily aware that other people feel differently. So just so you know, there are different terms that different people prefer. They have their reasons. I'm probably going to say most, if not all of them at some point. And those are terms like mental illness, mental health condition. Some people prefer crazy, and they have their reasons. Some people like to talk about madness. They have their reasons. Some people prefer terms like psychiatric disability to put it in the disability category rather than to separate it, or psych disability. And people have their reasons. None of these are wrong when used respectfully, especially by people who are describing their own experiences, but they do reflect a different worldview. And it's good to be aware that people have different beliefs on this, because understanding that is part of respecting everyone as the author of their own story. And respecting people as the author of their own story and the authority on their own life is a fundamental part of building a community of inclusion and equality. So I'm going to talk about some stories people tell about things like stigma, mental illness, treatment, and how they see themselves. One story that people tell is a story about that's predominantly focused on wanting to reduce stigma. This story goes along the lines of, I never thought people like me could need things like therapy and medication. I always thought of that as something for, like those crazies I see, or people who just like don't function at all, or those neurotic rich people who are always in therapy and always talking about their psychiatrists. But then I realized that I was tired all the time. I was exhausted. I didn't like anything anymore. And therapy and medication really helped me. And I want people to understand that this is just a chemical imbalance. It's like any other illness, and we don't need to be weird about it. And people need to understand that this is just a medical issue and not something we need to put in this other stigmatized category. That's one story, and it's an important story, and it's not the only real story. Another story that is just as real about stigma and treatment is one that goes like this. Everyone told me that I was sick and that I needed medication for a chemical imbalance in my brain. But I wasn't sick. I was just having a really hard time. I was struggling with my life in oppressive circumstances. Like maybe for some people, the story is I was gay and my family didn't like it and they wanted to treat this as a psychiatric issue. Or I didn't understand anything and I needed help. And for some people, their story is I only started to get better when I quit medicalizing my life, quit therapy, got off medication, and maybe sometimes fought for justice, or left an abusive relationship, or left a job that I wasn't well suited for, any number of other things. And that story reflects reality for some people, and it's just as important. Another story is that some people tell about their personal experience with stigma and treatment is one that's along the lines of, I faced one kind of stigma for being in treatment, I faced another kind of stigma for leaving treatment. And again, this is something people have told me directly, is that the stigma that I've faced for not being in treatment has sometimes loomed a lot larger, because people not only say I'm crazy, but they talk about like unmedicated, off your meds, like they expect me to flip out at them and want treatment to be the solution to that. And so this is complicated, and there's more than one story. So let's talk about some stories about therapy. Actually, another story about stigma that's another experience some people have is everyone wants to reassure me that there's no shame in medication, but I'm not ashamed. The available medications just don't work for me. Or maybe they do work some, but they have side effects that are much worse. That's an experience some people have. Or an experience some people have is medication helps, but only somewhat. There are a lot of symptoms I haven't found effective treatment for, and people telling me to get past stigma doesn't make any of this work more effectively. And that's another story that's real, that reflects a real experience a lot of people have. And then this is also true, that's true in one way of medication, it's true in another way of therapy. There's a lot of different stories, and there's a lot of different experiences, and there's a lot of different people in our communities who have access needs and who are the authors of their own stories. So here's one kind of story about therapy that's important, is a lot of people say, and as a rabbinical student, I hear this a lot from a lot of people, that therapy is very important to my professional sanity. I don't know what I would do without my therapist. You don't have to have major problems to benefit from therapy. That's a misconception. Therapy can be more like a tune-up to keep things running well, or to have somebody who understands who's not in it, who can help you see what your stuff is, where you're coming from. I really wish there was less stigma and less belief that you have to be crazy to go to therapy. Everyone should be in therapy. Therapy is great. This is the experience of a lot of people, particularly a lot of helping professionals like rabbis, therapists, psychologists. This is something that therapy can be. Another story about therapy that's very significant when we talk about mental health is some people have a story that goes like, I experienced trauma and I was having a really hard time coping with it. I was afraid to go to therapy because I'd heard so much about therapists being awful to people like me, but mine was actually really great. And I wish I'd considered therapy an option sooner. And stigma and scaremongering really kept me from getting help. And I wish people wouldn't talk that way because it was a barrier to me getting the thing that made my life better. Again, a real story, not uncommon. Another kind of story about therapy, which is also real, not uncommon, especially for a lot of marginalized people, is everyone keeps telling me to go to therapy. None of the therapists I've been to have actually helped me. None of them knew how to help me cope with long-term disability, or long-term disability on top of Jewish issues, or chronic mental health issues that did not resolve, or being gay or whatever else. And many of them were counterproductive. Some people have a story along those lines, like after 3 therapists told me to dress more femininely so that I would be accepted, I stopped going. I found peer support much more helpful. Again, another kind of story, just as real. All of these are experiences that people in our communities have. And one fundamental access need is to have space for your story and to have space for being respected as the author of your own story and the authority on your own life and what your experiences mean. And part of part of building accessible communities is understanding what our role is and what it isn't. Our role in building community, in building accessible community, is about access. It's not about treatment. It's not about getting people into treatment. It's not about getting people into good treatment. That's building referrals and resources can be a very good thing, but that's not what accessibility is. Mental health treatment choices are very complicated, very personal, not something we should expect to be able to solve for people in roles as rabbis, as cantors, as educators, as JCC directors, as program leaders. Our role is not treatment or solving treatment. Our role is accessibility. We're not here to decide what kind of treatment people get, or we're here to decide what kind of community we want to be. So again, accessibility is not treatment. Accessibility is not improving someone's mental health. It's about creating Jewish community where everyone is welcome and equal, and it's accessible on equal terms. So another way of framing the difference between accessibility and treatment is about improving or maintaining an individual person's mental health, and that's personal and private. Accessibility is about a Jewish community removing barriers, making it possible for more Jews to participate, regardless of whether their mental health improves, because sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes even with all available treatment, mental health doesn't improve. It can be chronic. Sometimes people make whatever choices they make, even if it's available, or people have their reasons. And our responsibility is accessibility. So just to mention this, there's a chat window as part of this webinar platform, and I'm continuously looking at the chat window. So if you put in a question in the chat window, I'll do my best to get to it. But I've said a lot of things, so I'm going to pause briefly to see, would anyone like to ask a question or comment on this so far? Okay, so if you would, feel free to, okay. So I see somebody raise their hand. Let's see.
Yeah, I have a question.
Sure.
So where in this community that we're building do you think these conversations are appropriate?
What do you mean by these conversations in the sense of talking about access or treatment? Can you just give me a few more words?
Well, a lot of what you said seems like very specifically stuff that people don't talk about. And I'm just wondering, like in a synagogue setting or in a community center setting, like, or educational setting, like where or between whom do you think conversations about mental health are appropriate?
I think that it's very appropriate and important for communities to start conversations, and especially for communities to start conversations that acknowledge multiple voices. What that looks like depends on what kind of program you're talking about. Like one thing that I think it's appropriate in most contexts is to organize, say, a panel that talks about different perspectives people have, or to make sure that if you're the kind of person in a community who makes referrals, that you know about a range of different options. If you're a rabbi or a cantor or someone who gives divrei Torah, I certainly think that it's an appropriate thing to talk about on the bima. If you're teaching children, I certainly think that, particularly if you're teaching a health class, talking about these issues is appropriate, especially if you're able to do it in a way that doesn't single anybody out. There are an increasing number of young adult novels and picture books that address some of these issues, and it could be appropriate in some contexts to pick one of those as a class book to discuss. Is that answering the kind of question?
Yeah, that's very helpful. So you were saying in a very public, general, non-personal, non-specific way, that's where the conversation is, you're hearing it.
I mean, I think that is one place that it is very appropriate, necessary, and important to start these conversations, because I think that mental health issues like being crazy, whatever, is very common in any community, and the prevalence is probably much higher in the Jewish community given our issues with generational trauma. And it's also probably increased since the American election and the things that have been developed, particularly in contexts where people are in Jewish community centers that have been receiving bomb threats. I think it could be appropriate to talk about reactions people sometimes have to that kind of thing in general terms. And I also think, depending on your role, it's not inappropriate to talk to individual people about what you're seeing with them or what you're seeing with their child. What's inappropriate is acting like you are the authority on the steps someone else should take in their own medical care. Because just like, and this is a place where I do think it's just like any other issues, we assume that medical decisions are private, but that doesn't mean that it isn't appropriate to talk about them ever, to point out resources. Does that make sense?
Yes, very much. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm gonna go on and talk about some specific examples now. Okay, so thank you for that question. And if anybody else would like a question, please feel free. Okay. Okay, this clicked to the wrong slide. Bear with me 1 second, I'll put it back in the right place. So again, another thing to keep in mind here, and this is a place I've seen the conversation about mental health and mental illness in the Jewish community kind of go off the rails a little, is access is an end in itself, but sometimes it gets discussed as though it's about treatment. Like, people will talk about it's important to facilitate access because it's good for people's recovery or mental health. And it might be, and it might not be. But that's really between somebody and whatever support they've chose to bring in. Improving mental health is not the purpose of creating community that's accessible for people with mental health issues. Access to Jewish community is an end in itself, because Jews are important and Jewish community is important. And that's true. That doesn't go away when somebody's crazy, and it doesn't go away if they stay crazy, because we all matter. Another component of thinking about mental health as an accessibility issue is that it's not always visible. There are certain tropes of mental illness visibility that show up on TV or in literature, and mental illness can look like that. But sometimes people get really good at hiding things, and some forms of psychiatric disability manifest in extreme need to hide things. That can especially be the case with eating disorders, for instance. Some people wear it on their sleeve, some hide it, and some people look like they have a different mental health condition than the one they actually have. So it's good to have a policy of assuming that people with mental health conditions are always present and always have a range of perspectives on their experiences. And if we build in that assumption all the time, it becomes much more straightforward to build high quality, accessible communities. And also, some people look weird but don't particularly have mental health impairments. Some people, for instance, have motion disorders. Like, I don't know, in the areas I grew up in, there was a gesture kids made that meant, like, you know, as hand movements that meant, haha, you're crazy, he's crazy. But people move oddly for a number of reasons, some of which have absolutely nothing to do with mental state. So it's good to be aware of, you don't know in either direction necessarily. And a lot of this is hard and a lot of this is complicated. So don't get discouraged if it's hard. And do remember that you don't need to be someone's doctor to facilitate access. And facilitating access is still worthwhile regardless of whether or not someone's condition improves. So how do we do this in practice? Some of it is about respecting boundaries. A lot of it comes down to that. Not all, but a lot. And part of respecting boundaries is understanding the difference between somebody being odd and somebody being threatening. It's okay to be weird. It's okay to speak oddly. It's okay to, you know, have various mood episodes. It's not okay to do things like touch people against their will, or to stare at people in bathrooms, or to otherwise violate serious boundaries. And it's really important to be mindful of the fact that accessibility does mean tolerating oddness. It does not mean tolerating violations. And that's important for the sake of people with mental health conditions who are much more likely to be the victims of violence than perpetrators of violence. And so actually people with mental health conditions are endangered on a number of levels if we conflate accessibility with tolerating boundary violations. It's one thing to keep in mind. So a lot of accessibility is about asserting boundaries. A lot of accessibility is about respecting boundaries. And this can be easier said than done, especially for people who are experiencing a lot of distress. People who are experiencing intense distress or alienation may attach themselves to you with a level of intensity that's inappropriate. And it's really important to be explicit about saying no and drawing lines, and to know that your responsibility is about facilitating access. It's not about solving all of somebody's problems or fixing everything that's missing in their Jewish experience. Some of it may not have a solution. Some of it may be their problem to solve. But some people who are experiencing this intense level of distress and loneliness might not know where the line is, might not pick up on hints, and might need you to be much more explicit about asserting it than you might feel is polite. And keeping in mind that it's not only okay, but necessary to do that sometimes. And it's much better if you're able to assert boundaries firmly before you get to the point where you're fed up and you get angry and you assert it, and you need to assert boundaries in an angry way. It's much better to just assume that there may at some point be some discomfort there, and remember that it's both okay and necessary. So one caution about boundaries is that something I've seen people do that sounds positive but is ultimately very inappropriate is use therapy referrals as their way to assert boundaries. And we've even, in rabbinical school, often been explicitly taught that this is the appropriate way to assert boundaries, that if somebody is attaching themselves to you more than is appropriate and has problems that loom much larger than what you can take on, the appropriate what we're often told is the appropriate thing to do is to tell them that, you know, we really empathize, we really want them to get help, and that a therapist can help them much more than we can, because, you know, they have expertise, they'll know how to help them. And that's a way to assert boundaries in a way that feels like we're doing something good rather than refusing to help them. The problem is it's not always true. For some people, it's not very likely that a therapist is going to be able to help them. For some people, there is no good referral. And for some people, even who would benefit from therapy, they're not at a point where they can either afford it or where they're ready to hear that. So I think it's really, and for people who are not in a place where going to therapy is a good idea, or where it's something that they want to do, it's not heard as something that feels supportive. It's heard as something that feels dismissive. So I think it's really important for us to separate the issue from asserting a boundary that we need to assert and making a referral that may be beneficial to someone. And one way of framing this is therapy referrals are advice. Therapy referrals are not the boundary. A therapist can help you better than I can may or may not be true. Whether or not you have a solution to offer, it's both okay and necessary to say no in some circumstances, because there may well not be a solution. Somebody needs to be welcome, and you can't take on more than it's reasonable for you to take on, because trying to do that will not be good for the person and will not be good for the community. And now where the line is often a judgment call. It's often confusing, but it's very important to keep in mind that you're going to encounter problems you can't solve, and you're going to encounter people who really want you to be the solution. It's important to learn to draw lines, and it's important to learn to draw lines without promising things about therapy that may or may not be true. And it's also worth, if you're in a position where therapy referrals are important, finding out what you can about advocacy areas in your advocacy groups in your area, about where might be a better place to send gay people, trans people, people who are questioning their gender, people of color, people who have had certain abuse experiences or disability experiences. There won't always be a solution, but looking out for what resources exist for specific populations is worth doing, just beyond the issue of figuring out who's good, or who has a good general reputation. Okay, so I'm going to move on to a new topic. I'm going to switch gears a bit, so I'm going to pause here for questions. Does anyone want to ask a question or say something about that last piece? Okay, so next piece I want to talk about is that not everyone feels safe, and it's very important to respond constructively to the fact that some people are going to be afraid of us and some people are going to be afraid in community. And for those of us who want to think of ourselves as warm and welcoming people, or as excellent teachers, or as compassionate people who can support everyone, it can be very emotionally challenging when somebody doesn't trust us or is afraid of us. And I think it's very important to learn not to take it personally. So part of this is thinking about responding to impaired trust constructively, because knowing when to trust people, knowing when not to, knowing the limits of trust is a skill. Trust is a skill. And not everybody has strong trust skills. Some people have very severely impaired trust skills. And that raises access issues for communities on a couple of levels. One is that some people won't trust you, and some people will be very fearful. And the other kind of trust issue that can come up is that some people will trust you more than they should immediately. And that can feel very validating. But that's a sign that somebody does not know how to defend their own boundaries, and that we need to be very careful to keep in mind what's appropriate and what's not, and help to establish lines so that our communities can be safe and accessible places, and people don't endanger themselves in our community by trusting us more than they should. And it can feel really good when people do that, but it's not a sign that things are going well. It's a sign that there's something dangerous that we need to be cautious about. So part of what responding to people with impaired trust skills constructively looks like, or people who are fearful, is honoring partial presence. And I don't know about you, but I've been in a lot of situations lately where people are very invested in the idea of being fully present. And that can be a really big problem for people who've experienced trauma, or people who have impaired trust, or people who are fearful in the community for any number of reasons. Because be fully present is a lot to ask of somebody who doesn't feel safe, or a person who doesn't know that the extent to which they're welcome, or a person who has never been able to count on being welcome and present in Jewish community. Be fully present and close your eyes, meditate, drop your boundaries, like get in this semi-hypnotic state that I'm asking you to be in, is really an incredibly large amount of trust to ask of people. And expecting everyone to comply with that on short notice is not reasonable. And if you're leading meditation, warning people that it's going to be happening in a service is really valuable. And it's also very much worth saying things like, close your eyes if you're comfortable. That gives people permission to be present and to be partially present and to participate to the extent that they feel safe. And facilitating partial presence is a really important accessibility step. Similarly, for people who have impaired trust skills in the other direction, inviting somebody, like pushing somebody to be fully present when you're not really prepared to deal with what that will look like for them, can be very dangerous. So being more clear about what we're asking for, what we're not, and that partial presence is okay, is very important. And another reason this is important is because if we're, say, leading meditation and talking about the importance of sitting with your demons and maybe letting your demons out to play, and we're thinking of the kind of demons that are like the typical hurts of everyday life, or the typical hurts of conflict, imperfect community, living in a very imperfect and partially redeemed world. And that's what we're gearing something for. And that's what we're prepared to handle constructively. And then we say, be fully present, put it all on the line. And somebody's demons are a lot larger than that, and we can't handle it constructively. We've betrayed that trust. And pressuring somebody into that situation is not fair to them, is not good for the community. And it's important to be mindful of that. For instance, I was once in a group session in rabbinical school, I think it was in Israel, And we were guided through a visualization where we were asked to think about a difficult situation in childhood. And I could tell that the way that was being facilitated was making certain assumptions that everyone's childhood was probably basically good, but everyone had been, picked last for a team, not gotten into a school they wanted to get into, experienced like the embarrassment of being rejected or not understanding something. But for some people, if you ask them to reflect on the demons of childhood, it's going to go much darker places. So thinking about that when you're talking about presence, when you're talking about bringing personal things into community conversation and prayer, thinking about the range of people who might be in the room and what you might be in effect asking of them is a really key part of building accessible community for people with mental health conditions, which are high prevalence in our community. So a very practical aspect of honoring partial presence and letting people participate to the extent that is safe and maybe comfortable for them is let people sit where they want and respect people's need to sit in less intimate spaces, even when you're trying to build greater group spirituality. A circle of chairs is too much intimacy for some people. And if somebody's showing up in community because they need to say Kaddish and yeah, okay, that's correct now. So if they need to say Kaddish and they're expecting that they might feel a great deal of anxiety coming into a synagogue, but it's really important to them to observe their mother's yahrzeit. And they expect, okay, I'll be able to sit in the back, get through the service, say Kaddish, and fulfill this even though it's really hard. And then you suddenly and unexpectedly arrange all the chairs in a circle, tell them, you need to come in, be part of the community. We all need to be together and break down walls. That can cause somebody to dissociate, to not be safe, and to not be able to participate and be present. And they might not come back. And it might result in them not being able to be in the community and not being able to say Kaddish and not being able to do things that are really important to them. So circles of chairs are not bad. Trying to create services with greater intimacy is not bad, but consent is really important. And being aware that boundaries are not bad and people draw their boundaries in different ways is part of building accessible community. And so if you want to do something unexpected, it's very good to announce what's different, or to even put it in the shul bulletin, and let people sit where they want to sit. Don't expect everyone to be okay in a circle of chairs. Don't expect greater intimacy to be right for everyone. Remember that intimacy requires consent, and make room for people to participate in services at multiple levels of intimacy. And again, I'm framing this in terms of synagogues because I do rabbinic work, but this is important in other types of programs too. Like if you're giving a public lecture, especially if it's about a difficult topic and some people are kind of sitting near the back, it's okay to invite people to come closer. But it's not okay to mock people for sitting in the back, and it's not okay to apply intense pressure. A lot of people have their reasons, and sitting in the back of the room or on the edge can be what enables them to be there. Similarly, having hashtags for lectures can be good. If you're doing programs, if you're doing a Havdalah program, this is also okay, this again is clicking to the wrong places for some reason. Okay, so This is also something that happens a lot in Havdalah, especially in youth programming, where people will be standing around in a circle, with their arms around each other, swaying and singing for an extended period of time. And for some people, that's way too much intimacy, and it's not comfortable or safe, regardless of the gender of the people touching them. And as we've talked about in previous webinars, for people with disabilities, being touched by women can actually be more threatening than being touched by men, because children who grow up with a disability typically experience intrusive therapy, and typically it's women doing it. So women in the audience, this applies to you too, keep that in mind. But if you're doing a Havdalah, and I've experienced this, I've seen this, and people are standing in the back, inviting them in can be great. Grabbing them and pulling them in is not okay. Some people do not want to put their arms around people. Some people don't want to be in the circle. Some people want to be in the back. And that's not a failure. It's people participating in the way that works for them. And if people are not fully comfortable and not fully present, that's okay, because partial presence means they're there. And making it possible for people to be there as they are, without making healing a prerequisite, is part of what makes us accessible communities. Another thing to keep in mind is that there's a lot of, I've heard in this conversation about trigger warnings, a lot of misconceptions about what triggers are and what they aren't. Triggering and upsetting are different things. A lot of topics are upsetting for, most people. Most people find discussion of child abuse upsetting. Most people find discussion of the Holocaust upsetting, especially if it's graphic. Some people also find those things triggering. And triggers are not limited to those kinds of topics. Some people are perfectly comfortable talking in those kinds of terms, but freak out if they're asked to say, hold a teddy bear, because they associate it with things, or can't listen to a certain song, or really don't like it if somebody touches them in a reassuring way and might really freak out. So being aware that triggers can be anything, and literally anything can potentially be a problem for somebody, and people might have strange reactions, and they have their reasons. And it doesn't necessarily mean anyone did something wrong, but it might be something to talk about how to handle it in the future. Like, some people, and especially if you're working with the same group in an ongoing basis and somebody has an issue, it might be worth talking to them about how they would like that to be handled, whether they need warnings about that kind of thing, whether there's another way of doing it that would work for them. And also to be aware that people who have experienced abuse may or may not find discussions of abuse triggering, and are perfectly capable of making their own decisions about what they are and aren't okay with being exposed to, and do not need other people to take that over for them. So being mindful that this is something that exists, and that people develop their own skills and make their own choices about trigger exposure, is also part of building accessible community. And in line with that, since literally anything can be triggering, and a lot of people, when they experience triggers related to trauma or something else, need to be able to leave quickly, it's important to keep escape routes open whenever it's possible, so that people know they'll be able to leave, because that makes it so that people who need to leave can. And it also makes it so that people who know that they might need to leave know that if they need to leave, they'll be able to, which sometimes is enough to stop a trigger from happening. So a couple of things: make sure exits are marked. If you're having a circle of chairs, it's really good to leave a gap so that there's a clear escape route, especially if there's multiple rows of chairs. Making sure exits are marked if you're on a program and people aren't going to be able to find their way back by themselves, making sure that there's somebody who can take people out if they need to be taken out, and making sure it's known who that person is a really important part of access, because if people know they can leave, it enables them to try. Not always possible in every context, but it's possible in more contexts than people realize. So one access step you can take is thinking about, where are there clear escape routes? Where aren't there? And where might it be able to create some? In youth programming, designated in and one of the things the accessibility floater can do is
Ruti, can you hear me? We seem to have lost the sound. We don't hear anything. And I'm not sure if you can hear me.
Meredith, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Ruti fell offline because the internet connection is wavering, but I'm gonna see if I can help.
Okay, great. So everybody stand by for just a moment. Thank you, Sasha.
I'm muted. Okay, can you hear me? Okay, Meredith, can you resume the recording? You're the host now. Can you resume the recording?
Actually, Sasha's the host.
Okay, Sasha, can you record?
It's recording now. Okay, terrific.
Okay. So, sorry about that, everyone. Everyone see the slides now?
Yep.
Cool. Okay. So, okay. So another part of this is consent and physical contact. Not everybody wants a hug. Ask first. Insist that people ask you first, because it's good modeling. And if you're working with children or teenagers, make that an explicit classroom rule and enforce it. It's good best practices for a number of reasons, and it's really good for mental health access. Okay, and okay. So let's talk about a couple of Jewish specific things, one of which is the holidays. The way we talk about tshuva and forgiveness can really be a problem for abuse survivors, or particularly for people who are really struggling not to return to a dangerous situation, can feel that the whole community is telling them that in order to be a good person or a good Jew, you have to go back, you have to reconcile. And some people shouldn't. And part of building accessible community is that when we talk on Yom Kippur, on Rosh Hashanah, about forgiveness and reconciling, it's important to be explicit about the fact that this is not a good idea for everyone. For some people, what tshuva looks like, what is maintaining your resolve to maintain distance from a relationship that is not right for you. And on Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, when we're doing any sort of programming for that, for any age, in any context, mentioning explicitly this limitation of that, and that it's not always appropriate to reconcile with everyone. And sometimes teshuvah means dafka not reconciling and dafka maintaining distance. And also providing resources for people who are in abusive situations, have exited abusive situations, needs to be part of how we do Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur programming. And it needs to be explicit that it's people of all genders, not just women. And we need to have resources that are appropriate for women, men, people of other gender combination, trans people, gay people. And that's part of doing appropriate mental health accessible Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah, High Holy Days programming, again, for any age group in any context. Another thing to be mindful of is to be careful. It's very important to be careful about alcohol. Not everyone can drink, not everybody wants to drink, not everyone should drink. And it's really alienating if when you go to Kiddush, there's only wine, or you have to ask for the grape juice, or only children are offered grape juice. Having both available on equal terms is part of accessibility for people who have alcohol issues, for people who take medication that is not compatible with alcohol, and also for women and for people who might be pregnant. If there's going to be wine, also have grape juice. If there's going to be alcohol that's interesting, say people are doing shots or something, as people often do at Kiddush or in other contexts, having other beverages that are interesting, like fancy juice or other things like that, can send the message that you regard people who do not drink as adults. And that's something that that's subtle, not necessarily difficult, but can really improve accessibility and perceived equality. One thing to be aware of for that is that for some people who take medications, grapefruit juice is also a problem. So grapefruit juice is probably not the solution to this problem, but providing beverages other than alcohol that are interesting and making sure grape juice is always available when wine is available can improve mental health access. Another thing to be aware of is that a lot of people have eating disorders, and you can't tell by looking. Some people are thin because they're thin. Some people are thin because they have a problem. Some people who are fat also have eating disorders. You can't tell by looking. And so it's really important not to pressure people to eat, not to comment on people's eating, not to say things like, oh, we're being so bad, or do you really need that cookie, or eat, you're so skinny. And another aspect of this is that weight loss is not always a good thing, and weight gain is not always related to behavior. Like sometimes people lose weight because they're sick. So initiating conversations about how great somebody's weight loss is not so great when somebody's weight loss could be the result of a problem. So stuff like that, don't bring it up unless they do, and be aware that you don't always know what's going on with people. A similar thing related to the food issue is when you're talking about fasting, it's important to be aware that some ways of talking about fasting can create problems for people with eating disorders, particularly when one thing I've heard a lot of people say from the Bima and leading Seders is something like, you know, on Yom Kippur, we're closer to angels and we master our base animal desire to eat food, and we exercise like a greater sphere of holiness by mastering our appetites. And the problem with that is that people with eating disorders often feel that eating is a failure of control, and that starving themselves is an exercise of a higher level self-control and mastery over base instincts. So venerating that attitude can be very dangerous, especially to people who only come to Jewish community at that time of year. So if you're talking about fasting, making sure that you're not sending the message that eating is good or fasting is better, it's very important. You can be framing it in terms of fasting in very limited ways at very limited times has effects that can be good, or it's the day of affliction or whatever, can be a good thing. Venerating fasting as a higher plane of existence is dangerous. Don't do it. Remind your community that bodies are important and that we're normally supposed to eat. I think this clicked to the wrong place. Okay, no, it did not. Okay, so above all, and these are a few examples. There are many others, and a lot of accessibility is creativity, and about collaborative problem solving. But above all, remember, everyone is the author of their own story, and Jewish community is an end in itself. And when we treat people as equals and the authority of their own experiences and make room for people to participate as the people they are, regardless of whether they get better, regardless of what treatment decisions they are or aren't making, we can really facilitate access for a lot of people and create a much more inclusive and equal community. We just have a couple of minutes left. So at this point, does anyone have questions? Also, I think the caption said a much more clues I have community, but what I said was inclusive community. So when we treat people as the authors of their own stories and create space for people to participate as they are, we can create a much more inclusive and welcoming community. So, questions, thoughts? Okay, so thank you for coming. Thank you for coming, everyone. And let's go forth and make more inclusive community. And if you think of questions after the fact, please feel free to shoot us an email or tweet at us. And Meredith, what's this week's giveaway going to be?
This week's giveaway, you know what, I'm going to have to look it up. But check out our Facebook page or Twitter page, Matan Inc., INC on both, and follow us there. We have a giveaway every week of February for Jewish Disability Awareness and Inclusion Month, and we would love for everybody to participate. And thank you again for joining us on this webinar with Ruti Regan on mental health in the Jewish community. For more information about Matan, you can visit us at www.matankids, or send us an email at info@matankids.org. Thank you so much, Ruti, and thank you all for being with us.